최성희 선생님. This is what it feels like to be home. Fantastic. Can you hear me okay at the back? Or, yeah, very good. And it's exciting to get to see old-time friends from all the way from my Iwa days. And when I say it feels like to be home, I really mean it. Iwa really was my home in many ways. And so this is particularly exciting and thrilling. And I'd like to thank everybody for being here. I know it's very busy time of the semester, and you know a lot going on, and I really appreciate your willingness and interest in coming in here. This rather awkwardly phrased talk, 그 여자의 여자, and I will also try and sort of present some resonances of that phrase. I mean, it's a kind of a translation of her woman, and you'll get to hear from me, I hope, like what this phrase does in my talk, but also in the way that I'm presenting the various sort of food, we feel like sort of resonances of that, you know, in sort of my presentation of the second sex in this context. Just curious about the audience kind of demographic. I mean, I would assume that many of you are interested in feminist theory, literature, kind of philosophy, and so at least you will have some familiarity with this text, right? The second sex, and so. And I think it's one of those sort of texts that, just like the Bible, right? People heard about it a lot and you know make reference to some of the passages, but not everybody, including sort of feminist theorists, haven't had a chance to really read it with a kind of renewed interest. And I think that's kind of partly what I'm trying to do, with, as you can see from the subtitle, a focus on what I call translingual perspective, deployed in the presentation and exposition of some of the passages. Now, I want to be also sure about the time frame. How many minutes am I supposed to speak? About an hour. Okay, and then will there be sort of Q&A for a while? Okay, so we're looking at about 6:30, then that's when we wrap it up. Very good. Okay. So, 1 hour, it feels long, but also it feels very short. I mean, you know, if you look at the second sex, this is it's a wild book. As you'll see, she begins with an announcement, you know, that I hesitated for a long time to write a book on women. It's irritating. And then she just goes in and writes the whole thesis on this topic. And so this presentation is not meant to be a kind of summary of what this book is about, or a certain particular polemical argument on some of the key moments and points in the book. Rather, this talk is about reworking the slogan that you might have heard. 여자는 태어나는 것이 아니고 만들어지는 것이다. Right? That's how we typically sort of take the book to mean, right, as a thesis, and given the space and constraints of time that we have, I'm just going to really kind of unpack that sentence translingually, meaning in English and in French and in Korean and some other registers, and see what lesson does that sentence still carry for us in this age of, let's say, post-feminism or the fourth wave feminism, right? As you may have heard, I mean, as you have learned, like, you know, Simone De Beauvoir, she is like the godmother mother of the second wave feminism, right? So we tend to think, well, Simone De Beauvoir, who reads Simone De Beauvoir? Well, I do. In the same way, perhaps the way that I read René Descartes. Descartes is a very kind of, classical, sort of, sometimes people might think old-fashioned, philosopher, passé, as we say, right? But what I'm trying to show is that they're not passé, they're not old-fashioned, right? There's a reason for them to be classic, and what matters is how we re-engage their text, right? And so what I'm trying to do is to present this slogan, not just as a slogan, but as a kind of a linchpin around which we can think about some of the specific issues that surround us today, both globally and locally, and also translingual context. Now, I'll try and explain what I mean by translingual also in some bullet points, but also through my exposition. Okay, so if the pace is okay, then I think we can just go on, and then the bit of also a preliminary remark, but also a bit of apology. It's been 24 something years since I came back to Korea, and then half of my brain is sort of waking up now, and so I have never done any presentation or writing, in fact, in Korean after I left Ewha. And I think it was fantastic training for me to have written this thesis, MA thesis on Derrida in Korean. And at the time, I was also fairly more comfortable in English. And I was reading everything in English, but there's no translation of Derrida. And I think it's sort of interesting. It might be relevant to what I have to say. And so initial plan was for me to write this thesis in English. But back in those days, it was considered to be a little strange for anybody to write in Korea to thesis in English. And also, there was an intellectual principle which I really took to be quite persuasive and very interesting, that I have to work it out, right? This in the language that I inhabit. And so I really went through the training of really making things up as I go along. And so I feel that I've had experience of really kind of forcing my way through and negotiating my way through the language that I was also almost inventing. In the way that perhaps Derrida is also kind of reworking in the French language that he inhabits in some less straightforward way. And so my presentation is going to be mostly, this is in English, and I wrote this in English, but about second half, towards the end of it, I'm going to present certain elements of my experience of Korean language, and also what I seem to see in the issues of gendered language, right? In Korean. And I think revisiting the language from my point of view as somebody who has been inhabiting this other language for a long time, I'm relearning the Korean language in a very, very interesting way. It sort of comes to me in a very, it's like this is my first language and then second language took over, right? And now first language is sort of coming back in a very interesting way. And so I don't really believe in sort of native versus other, and it's more like a sequential sort of unfolding of this linguistic resources that we all inhabit. And I use the word inhabit very intentionally because it's more a question of really embodying the experience of languages. So without further ado, let me go and try and start the conversation. So before I go, I want to just give you a structure of what my talk is going to be about, like in terms of structure. As Julie mentioned, one of the sort of long-term projects that I'm doing is to write a book on the second sex. This question is quite simple. In the way that I was also writing my book on Descartes, my interest was simply to ask why and how we should reread Simone De Beauvoir today. Right. in the age of post-feminism and all sorts of crises in critical theory, etc. And how do we read it? This is a question that comes to me in a very vivid way, and I'll show you some methodological sort of experimentations that I've been doing so far. Let's see. So this is a photo of Simone De Beauvoir. Right? When it came out, it was taken by this photographer called Art Shea, who was a friend of what's his name? Suddenly I'm forgetting. Nelson. Forget his name. The Beauvoir's boyfriend, basically. So she had Jean-Paul Sartre, right, in Paris, and then the other, the guy in Chicago. So they were lovers, and the story goes that Beauvoir was staying in this man's apartment. And the photographer friend sort of took a photo of her like that, and it's kind of rude, as you can see. It's not exactly a happy photo. And so when it came out, a lot of feminist philosophers were very angry and they were protesting, right? And so we should see the bottoms of male philosophers too, right? If you're going to show this scandalous kind of a physicalization, eroticization, objectification of the female body, etc. And I just show this picture also partly because I've written an essay looking at this particular photo and see what to do with this object, right? And also how do we re-engage Simone De Beauvoir. Now, we are also looking at the back of Simone De Beauvoir, right? She's gone. The totality of it is kind of interesting, right? And she's looking, she's doing, my writing is called Should My Bum Look Bigger in This? It's like, it's a parody on the, and now, so my piece was on a reading of toiletry, right? It's sort of cosmetic kind of, adornment that the women are supposed to specialize in. There's a section in the second sex about that, right? And so that's certain female vanity, etc. So I was really trying to deconstruct that by using this image. Anyway, so just for you to have a look at while I'm trying to explain a little bit of the background to this interest in looking at, especially that line, right? One is not born woman, but becomes a woman, right? On ne naît pas femme, on le devient. Right? That's the line. So Simone De Beauvoir, when she was writing her works of philosophy and literature and drama and all sorts of journalistic also kind of work, she was not simply a follower of, let's say, Jean-Paul Sartre, right? But she also wanted to, at the same time, cast herself as a follower, so which really kind of puzzled a lot of people, right? And when a journalist will ask her, so what's your philosophy like? How do you come up with the ideas? And we'll say, I'm just simply following Jean-Paul Sartre. I mean, that my ideas is coming from him. So it's very kind of puzzling from our point of view to hear that. And you can see that this is partly her strategy, right? To have our views validated in a way, right? And we cannot take it at its face value. There's something about following, right? What it means to follow a thinker, right? And so what it does in terms of her thinking. And in fact, most of scholars these days also look at how some of the kind of ideas that Beauvoir proposed and experiment with in the Ethics of Ambiguity and other really amazing philosophical works, they influenced the way that also Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre, all these existentialist philosophers are doing philosophy, right? And so the question of sort of reciprocity or influence is very complex, and we'll see later on when I look at the question of the second, how the kind of interpersonal dimension in philosophy really matters in gendered context too. So keep that in mind. So during her time, Simone De Beauvoir was not just a follower. she was following certain kind of passions for philosophy that she does and did as a woman, and also as a thinker and as a human being, as existentialist philosopher. That's one point of interest. Another thing that I want to mention in this context is this: when she was a philosopher, when she presents herself as a writer who also does philosophy. Her philosophy was very new in the sense that she did not simply kind of follow the conventional format of doing philosophy. What she did was just to propose and perform, if you like, a new way of doing philosophy, right? And she was dramatizing as well. We were just talking about drama, which Song Yi saying a while ago. A new way to dramatize life, right? That is a way of doing philosophy for her too, which is very interesting, right? I mean, as you know, in 1970s and 80s, in the French feminist circle, there's a l'écriture féminine, right? There's sort of what is it? The feminine writing, right? Has become an interesting kind of genre, right? I mean, how do we write? How do we write? I mean, that question is inseparable from what we write, right? And you can see a kind of precursor to that in, for instance, the way that Beauvoir was writing her pieces, and we'll have a look at that later on. And so, okay, The Second Sex was published in France as Le Deuxième Sexe in 1949, right? So that's like already hung up, right? That's like a way hung up, right? So you can imagine 2009 was an important year for a lot of scholars across the globe, right? Especially for French philosophers too. And so it's interesting around that time. I think that's around the time when I began to be interested in rereading Simone de Beauvoir. Now, at that time, so already now like a few years back, Julia Kristeva wrote a piece really praising the genius of Simone de Beauvoir, who seems to be undervalued still, right? And she talks about the genius of The Second Sex, especially this work, in terms of its impact on not only the kind of French feminist philosophy as a kind of almost founding moment, right? In for instance, thinking about the other, l'autre, right? The woman as the other, as a concept, is a very, very important anchor, right? For the followers, right? And so you see a traces of that right back in The Second Sex, right? Introduction to Second Sex really is devoted to the analysis of this notion of l'autre, right? The other, women as the other. And so there, for instance, just like Kristeva talks about, there is a kind of, let's say, Beauvoir de Beauvoir, right? The Beauvoir, him, Beauvoir is Beauvoir, right? Him is a power of Beauvoir, right? And I do like a sort of a little cheesy French pun, like a Beauvoir de Beauvoir, right? Beauvoir de Beauvoir, right? So now, what interests me is really that line, especially the kind of secondness, right? The secondness, and I'll get to that and I'll see why that's important. And so there is almost like a second life of The Second Sex, right? Coming right back, right? With the celebration of very classical now stature, right? As one of the founding mothers, almost like a biblical figure, you know, in the French circle. Again, nobody seems to read it because they think it's all like, you know, old-fashioned for various reasons. Now, let me then look at this. Okay, who is Simone de Beauvoir? You know, she had her own, let's say, particularities, right? She grew up in a very Catholic, fairly well-to-do, you know, the suburban Paris household. She went to Catholic school, and you know, she hardly left when she was living in Paris, the French, you know, the Latin quarters, right? So she had a fairly kind of elite education, academic feminist, intellectual feminist, right? Living practically in hotels, right? She refused to do housework, right? So she lived with Jean-Paul Sartre, and you know, and was writing every day. Hotel. So, and then was discussing philosophy at cafe with the Merleau-Ponty and all these people, right? So very unique person, and she has her particularities, right? So now we are asking the right question: what does she have to do with us, whoever we are, right? This is a question that third wave feminism is asking, right? White woman, fairly privileged French, educated elite philosopher, right? And with a very rich erotic life, right? And she was known to be also bisexual. And she got into this erotic game with Jean-Paul Sartre and trying to sort of make the other person jealous by boasting about the other erotic conquest. And so it's kind of very interesting, a little philosophically messy life that she had, right? So the question that we are asking is this: what does someone like her, right, and her work to do with us or whoever we are, right? So let's say this is a kind of question. This is a distance or connection between Beauvoir of 1949 and 50s and Simone De Beauvoir and beyond and after of 21st century, right? You see, Yöja, I think it was in part inspired by this soap opera, and a friend of mine was encouraging me to watch that drama. 내 남자의 여자. So that's the code. That's the code, right? So 그 여자의 여자. I was just simply replacing that, right? And so you have various sort of, and look at this. Do I have a pointer here? But maybe not. Can you see this? Okay, you can see this. This is amazing photo. This is from Iungno. I mean, many of the materials here I actually got to see now this time. Like I've been now staying here for 2 months now. I mean, I've been going to many different exhibitions thanks to many of my friends. And you see, some of my students from Kia's seminar is here. Thanks to you, I got to really discover an interesting photo, right? And this is from Iungno's photo of this woman. And you know what it says? 이곳에 잊지 마시오. Right? This is only the U.S. Soldier, right? This is a prohibited zone, right? 이곳에 잊지 마시오, right? And you have a man reading a newspaper, and you have I should have just put a here. Oh, sorry. Okay, this one. 이곳에 잊지 마시오. Can we dim the light? Oh, very good. That's good. You see, 이곳에 잊지 마시오. Red Cross only. 미국 하나, right? See, this is 1950s, right? So you're looking at the kind of two different pictures, right? We're looking at this person who is having transatlantic love affair, right, in her spare time, and you have this person, right, standing almost indifferently or in kind of in defiance of us, right? To this. No loitering, right? This side. So it's a very different background, different context. So what's the connection between these two, right? That will be one of the questions that you can ask. Now, if we also have the obligation to think about the second sex, or women, in short, in, let's say, the third world context, right? The other world context. We should think about feminism in terms of its transitory or transformative, right, dimension. How feminism as a movement of thought and action, right, how does that have an impact in the way we create alternative space? So the question is, if feminist thinking and theory and philosophy is a movement in itself and of itself, what happens if we move that thought itself, right? That transpose it, transport it, right, elsewhere. So my approach is, as you can see from this title, translingual. Instead of, or rather also against the background of so-called like a transnational feminism, I'm interested in having access to these sort of questions of differences within feminism by paying attention to languages, right? So it's more like a transcultural or translingual feminism, right? So I'm not abandoning national differences, but what I'm saying is that so-called national differences are often embodied in linguistic practices. And language becomes the lens through which we look at how the embodied questions of gendered life, right, occur. Right? 언어의 중요성이 제 생각에는 아주 필요하다고 생각합니다. Hence, translingual. So, what do I mean by translingual? Translingual, when I think about it, I use it from this literary critic's work, Lydia Liu, Translingual Practice. She defines translingualism as a kind of cross-cultural appropriation, critique, and reinvention of a language. And in some other contexts, and this is a citation from Stephen Kellman, Switching Languages, translingual thinkers express thoughts and theories in multiple verbal system. Okay, multiple verbal system. So, of course, translingualism then involves translation. That's given, right? But what I'm saying is that it's not just a question of transposing or moving a thought, right, expressed in one language to another space and fix it. There is no equivalence, as we all know, in Translation 101, right, lesson. What matters, what I'm saying is looking at the movement in between, right? And so you have to look at multiple verbal systems, right? So you have a movement between or among languages, but also within a language, right? And I will see within a language there is a space for newness, right? Let's say, and I'll talk about it later on. 여자 is a very neutral word, right? And I haven't really thought about it until I left, 이화여자대학교. We say 이화여자대학교. We don't say 이화기집애대학교, right? Or we don't say 이화여성대학교, right? Right? Or we don't say 이화 사모님 to be 대학교, right? Right? But we produce all sorts of 여자, right? Right? And then these people become, right, various forms of 여자, right? So within 한국말, 여자 is a kind of but 여자, we hardly use it, right? It's an interesting question. We say 아줌마, or it's very interesting. 여자 is a kind of, and also I gave a different versions of this because I'm writing translingual of Beauvoi to translators and French theorists in Japan, for instance, right? They never use 여자. No, I mean they use it, but they don't say 여인, for instance, right? 여인 is for instance, like in China, they don't use 여자. That's very strange for them, right? But we use 여자 so centrally. So it's like this is a very hybrid Korean, Chinese Korean, right? Because a 자 is like, if 자 is such a big ending, right? A lot of 자, like a 자 also is a stand-in for boy, right? The girl's name. But also 자 has I learned about it from Chinese friends. 자 has a function of like objectification, right? As in like one who does certain things, right? Right? 살인자. And so on, right? Sorry about the association, but so here, what's fascinating for me is that translingual allows you not only to look at language A, language B, but within language, what we tend to take as one language, you have all sorts of different energies. It's like quantum leaps, right? And so by looking at those traffics, right, we can see what's going on, right? So I still come out of a very kind of textual tradition of looking at the text, right, as a window to the world. But what I don't want to do is just get trapped, right, in that, right, textual world. I want to use it as a kind of window to the world outside, right. And I believe by paying attention to the ways that languages work, right? Words work and words behave, not simply to move, right, or mean, we can understand and see what's going on in the world and what should take place. So that's pretty much the kind of certain a little polemical, if you like, well, not polemical, sort of a bit of a sort of claim that I'm trying to make, right, in this talk. Now, so what matters is not only to look at sort of the words and taking it as a unit, but really breaking it apart, right? And look at the rhetorical behavior, but also phenomenological layers of it, right? And I call that linguistic affectivity, right? And so this one is from, I'm staying on Iwa campus, and there's a travel site. There's a kind of Tracy, that's what it's called, Tracy. It's kind of a strange name. It's a recommendation of travel sites and what to do in Korea. And one of the top 10 things is to go and visit the cosmetic specialist who does the cosmetic for celebrities, right? And you pay $300 for a session, right? And so this is one of the things, right? How gendered it is, right? Think about it, right? So go to Gyeongbokgung or go and have blah blah blah. And number 5 or 6 is to have what? Be like a celebrity, K-pop, right? And so the plastic surgery and everything. This is part of the packaged cultural kind of activity. Okay, you can see it. I mean, as a kind of what kind of traffic is going on in that visual language. When I talk about language, I also mean visual language, right? The analysis of it. So let me move on a little bit from here. So number 2. Moving on to the second part of my talk, a close-up on the line that I mentioned earlier. Quickly, before I get there, I want to just sort of maybe give a little bit of map, sort of a bit of structure to what I've been talking about in terms of 3 different categories. So. Under the translingual kind of approach to feminist thinking or any kind of socially engaged thinking, what I'm suggesting is that we should deploy, right, all sorts of resources, right, and I call that like a ménage à trois, like 3 things should come together. There has to be conceptual thinking, but also close reading, right. I mean, this is my one chapter of my book is the analysis of that line, right? So close reading is really important. It's something that I learned that from literature, right? Conceptual thinking is from philosophy, I suppose, right? And then you have to also do creative writing. So this is and also, as I talked about, as I giving you that, like a little bit of assemblage of images, right? And I think any kind of a live thinking should be 3rd dimensional. I don't mean 3-dimensional. A 3rd dimension, as in like there's always another dimension, right? 3rd dimension. I've written a little piece, a small piece, I should rather say, called the 3rd dimension of feminism, where I'm emphasizing the importance to really go to the site-specific thinking. And so I mean the 여기 잊지 마시오, that's very site-specific, and I'm fascinated by the spelling of it. 잊지 마시오. It's E-I-E-S, 잊지 마시오. Probably that's how they spelled it, but when I hear it, it's like a don't forget, right? It's very strange, 잊지 마시오, right? And they're context specific and elastic. So we should be able to look at a very particular occurrence of images and be able to zoom back and look at it from a theoretical point of view. So macro elasticity, I think, is an important methodological consideration. Another thing is any kind of inventive thinking should be transformative, right? Trans means like move across, right? So we have a transdisciplinary kind of activity and transfigural. What I mean by transfigural is you see the kind of how the figures change. Let me go back to this. How do I go back? I don't want to share the page down. No, page up. Here we go. Here we go. I got it. Yeah, here we go. So this is an interesting. This is like a recent work by David Han. Isn't that interesting? This is a hybrid of the classical, the Greek Venus style, Latin Greco-Roman Venus style figure, right? Meshing with that with the Korean 3 Korean women. It's like a patochina. This is a patochina position. This is like sitting. It's not standing, but sitting, right? And then like having this sort of, this is very, very interesting. You have a Venus like, but the position is like a tteokbokki. So this is a daily market. She got an award for this really interesting work, right? So this is what I mean by transfigure, right? It's not a question of rejecting or somehow hoarding, right? this sort of various figural imaginary, but how you actually combine those two to create a different figure, right? And so that's also why I was including that. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. So, you see. So now we are moving on to the actual reading of the text. Before I get to the second, right? So the way I work, also typically, but also in this book, I literally, I don't want to falsely promise anything because I haven't finished it, but I'm looking at literally the three words: the, second, sex. They're very complex words, just like a Facebook like, right? Like is one of the most complex words. We just have to click it, right? But in fact, I mean, you know, all sorts of things going on. Like you just have to kind of, but the, if you think about Korean word, right? We don't have the, plural, you know. Right, it's not much different, right? The indefinite article and definite article. This is a very, very important issue, right? So the sex, right? The second sex, right? And now my interest in is really this. I mean, the project really was motivated by this kind of question that I had, which is, if you look at the book, you know, from the introduction, Beauvoi talks a lot about the other, women as the other. But then why is it she didn't call it the other sex? She called it the second sex, right? So that really sparked my interest, right? So let's see what she says about the other, right? Then I'm going to move on to why I think she is talking about the second rather than the other. So this is fairly a classical, standard kind of description of why is the other. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other, right? The category of the other, l'autre, right, as in other, alternative or alterity, and this is the origin of that concept, is as primordial as consciousness itself. In the most primitive societies, in the most ancient mythologies, one finds the expression of a duality that is that of the self and the other, right? The other. So, so typically, for instance, I mean, you know, you hear about, for instance, in what sense philosophy professor is gendered, right? I mean, you know, so if you think about a philosophy professor, you don't imagine someone like me. Now you do, right? But I mean, you know, you think about this bearded man somehow, you know, sitting somewhere bored and kind of, you know, looking out the window and doing this, so, you know, so that's the image of a philosopher, right? Le professeur, right? Even even the word la professeur doesn't exist because that's the one, right? And oh, the other professor, that will be, oh, the other one, right? Oh, extra, right? 덤 하는 사람, right? 덤으로 주는 온 사람, 아니면 그냥 하나 껴주는 사람이나 그냥 affirmative action 하는 사람, 아니면 좀 모자라지만 그냥 해주는 거, 아니면 뭐 부인 사람, 자기는 아니고 근데 부인이니까 한 뭐 이런 식으로 the other, right? That's the concept. Now let me move on to the more interesting part. Then she says this, also in the beginning of the second sex. I want everybody to really pay attention to this part. Right? I mean, it's the irony of the second is palpable, right, in this passage, and I think this kind of thing that people haven't perhaps paid much attention to. I mean, this is what interests me. Some say that having been created after Adam, she is evidently a secondary being. Obviously, well, she's secondary because she comes after Adam. Others say, on the contrary, that Adam was only a rough draft. And that God succeeded in producing the human being in perfection when He created Eve, right? This, for me, says it all, right? The tone of the text, right? She is mocking the whole the origination myth, right? Well, obviously, she's a second being, right? That's the secondary meaning second, right? But then, where does Adam come from? And the Adam is only a rough draft. So this is she's attacking the whole kind of this sort of the logically the questions of origination, right, and the creation myth, right? Now, if you look at it in a very kind of rigorous biblical and hermeneutical context, this also has its own multiplicities, right? And so we just have to rely on some of the popular lines of thinking about this particular sort of sense. But a common assumptions that we share is this: well, the women are derivative from men, right? Because men were created first, and then the second, right? That's why it's the second sex, right? Now, as a philosopher, as a thinker, she's pointing to the irony of it, right? The impossibility of so-called, but then well, so that the man is not called the first sex, right? Man is either ultrasexual or asexual, right? Man is either not sexed at all, or suddenly turning into a sexual beast, right? So interesting irony there, right? So in order for there to be a first sex, which is not named as such, the second sex has to be named, right? That is the point, right? So women, the other, has to be sexed or sexualized so that the first can be established, right? And this, I think, is a genius of Beauvoir, right, as a thinker, right? That's why she didn't simply call it the other sex. It's a second sex, right? Something that comes after the following, right? And so she would have this really amazing line: this corollary requirement, impartial judge, an angel, neither man nor woman. But where should we find one? So I'm looking for the angel, right? And some think about this angel in terms of her kind of psychical bisexuality, certain kind of, androgyny, right? Somehow the figure that is neither man nor woman, but also both man and woman. So what I'm saying is that, certain claim that I'm making here is this: the second of second sex, if you look at the book all the way through too, typically we tend to think about it as, that means like a secondary or derivative or not as important as, etc. But what Beauvoir is showing here is that the second sex, when she talked about it, referred to as second sex, is meant to be deconstructive. It actually shows the absence or vacuity of the first sex. There is no such thing as a center, right? Man as such cannot exist without and unless there is what? This thing that we set up as a second sex after the fact, right? So it's a sequential logic of not only building but also subverting is what really is interesting, what's going on in this book. This is a little tricky, but that's basically the point that I want to press on. What it does, the sequential sequentialization of sexed being, as it were, right? Sequentialization. What it allows is to open up the possibility of the sexual evolution, right? What it means, there could be a third sex, there could be the fourth sex, and so on, right? Although she didn't quite mean it that way, right? Think about this. One is not born woman, but becomes a woman, right? When I presented this idea in Italy, I had a very interesting students coming in, a PhD student who was writing on gender studies topic, and she said, I'm actually involved in transgender movement. I'm working with a lot of transgender activists, and we're using it as a slogan. Fascinating, right? So becoming a woman, right? Becomes literal, right? Because it's a second, becoming something else, right? Becoming, right? So one can think about the way the sexuation becomes a tool for objectifying oppression, right, and control, and at the same time, what? A threat, right, to the new, of the new, right? And so you don't have to be just that person, natal sex, right? In other words, the thesis that you can draw from this idea of the secondness of sex or sexuality is that natal sex is not the final sex, right? That's why it's not the other sex, it's second sex. I mean, that's my way of reading it, and I can go into, I mean, I guess I'll have to write a book so that you can look at the argument in detail, but basically that's what it is. Another thing that I want to show is this. So, in looking at the second, as you have seen just earlier, from this passage, but also other passages that I can also introduce later if you're interested in having more conversation on this. So, typically, we tend to think about second sex in the second, the deuxième sex, in terms of primary and secondary. But what I'm saying is that it's more like an ordinal and primal. Right? It's about the order. Right? It's not primary, secondary, but ordinal. It's about the order of things. Right? And also, the second sex is interesting. It's also, I think, it's about the second person. Right? Second person. What is it? You. Right? This is something that she talks about a lot in the introduction to the second sex. Insofar as we are talking about human beings, sexed and sexuated and sexualized and with sexual energy, libido, right? In human interactions, there are much kind of has a sexual energy. The problem is this. Her question is, why is it that, well, if women are so oppressed and controlled and always, becoming like a little object, right, in the household of man, in the world of man, why is that they don't revolt? How do you explain the perpetuation of the oppression of women? Sometimes by the women themselves, right? Why no revolution, right? All this way, all the way through. And she explains that in terms of Hegelian dialectic of complicity. Right? Complicity, meaning one and the other get caught up in this very messy, insoluble, right? A drama of interdependence, right? And she calls it complicity. Pli is the French word le pli. Pli as we say explain, right? That means to fold, right? Explain means to unfold it, right? Explain, right? Or explicate, as is French like explication, like pli. Right? So complicity means what? They are folded together, right? So when you have a 여친, 남친, right, problem, right? This is something interesting, like the 여친, 남친, very gendered too. Not just chin, but it has to be 여친 or 남친, not chin. Then it's theory has a way of, this relationship has a way of resisting theory, right? Because it's interpersonally locked in. In other words, the second sex, right, is insofar as it follows the first, right? Goes into contractual relationship with the one, right? So ordinal is the first one, right? Second meaning of second, I think, is a contractual. It's a personal, interpersonal, right? Not just the kind of secondary or derivative, right? And the third one that I just mentioned is sequential. It goes on and on, right? Third, fourth, fifth is logically guaranteed by the setup that allows the first and the second to come into place, right? That's the point. And I don't need to read the whole thing, and just kind of. And with that, I just want to draw your attention to some of the questions about the reading. Quickly, you have the. Did you make the handout there? Well, it's just a small font, but you have it. So. I want to show you four different kind of translations. You have a Korean translation, and then first, the left column, right, is. This is the first translation, 1963. 2009, as I mentioned, right, there's a Panga, translation, Greek translation, and then this is the original. Look at the first sentence. First sentence. It might seem very different. It might seem just the same, but if you look at the first sentence, for a long time I've hesitated to write a book on women. Compare that to the second one. I hesitate a long time before writing a book on women. The original says, j'ai longtemps hésité à écrire un livre sur la femme, right? Now, I just want to draw attention your attention to the differences between two different translations. It's interesting, the first one actually haven't promoted I right at the beginning, right? It focuses more on for a long time, right? Whereas the second one is I have had a long time before writing a book on woman, right, etc. Go on, and it says, enough ink has been spilled in quarreling over feminism. Now, second translation says, enough ink has flowed over the quarrel about feminism. Interesting, right? Enough ink has been spilled. This is a kind of idiom, but still, right? This image is very different, right? Now, if you look at also the original, Beauvoi is famous for writing this torrential writing, right? She's hesitating, but then she's just kind of unlocking, right? There's a lot of also it's a French style writing, a lot of semicolons, and it's like breathless. It's like the onset of tsunami of these ideas, right? She's irritated, agitated, angry, upset, pleased, all of that, right? So you have the emotion of this kind of, a surge of emotion expressed in the block of writing. You see that, right? Now, the very first one, but first we must ask, what is a woman? There is what? New paragraph, right? The second translation has not broken this up. It remains more faithful to the original, right? Because the original stays in the same paragraph, right? And I looked at the Korean translation too, and it's the same, right? 여자란 무엇인가 stays in the same paragraph. Okay, it's interesting. This is one of the reasons why this book had to be retranslated. Right? I don't want to get into sort of gender guessing game, but you can guess. So one is by a man, the other one is by a woman, right? I mean, two women, in fact, right? It's interesting. The first translation was done by a retired zoologist professor. The Knopf, right? The very famous, the New York-based publisher, right? The wife of that publisher happened to be traveling through Paris in 1949, and she saw this really sensational book that everybody's writing about and reading about, right? The deuxième sexe, right? And so she brought a copy and showed it to her husband. This is hot, right? We should publish it, translate it, and then because there's a word sex, they thought it's about sex. So they sent it to the zoologist. Right? And it's a fairly really good translation. I mean, up till 2009, people were reading it. This is the one they read, right? A lot of, at least about 20%, they say, has been cut out. The parts that he didn't like. Some parts about lesbianism is a little off, maybe. Also, some parts that he didn't understand or didn't like, he just skipped, right? So it's incomplete. And some of the words are kind of interesting. You can see even the little stylistic differences really are telling, right? And so the 2009 in Hwangap, the effort was made to try the complete translation of the second sex and also redoing it, right? And Random House published it, right? It's interesting. Now there's a big debate among scholars about the merits of the two different translations, right? And it's interesting. And also I looked at this is partly why also I was really interested in looking, at the stuff in the library at Ihwa. Also, see 2009, Korean translation appeared, right? So this is like a new, and in China too, 2009, retranslation, complete translation. Think about it. Beauvoi, when it came out in translation, all of the world people were excited that they were reading it. But they were reading a kind of what? A little compromised versions. I'm not saying this is a problem, but it's a kind of interesting, again, unfolding, right? Of the perpetual problems in the kind of theory making. Now, so just a kind of a bit of taster. So if you look at it, just to look at the differences and see how they remain telling. I hope that will be interesting. One thing that I want to also say is this. For those of you who know a bit of French too, I don't know French well enough to be able to really get the nuance right, but I've done some study also to trying to read them, and my field is in French philosophy, so I better read a bit more. And I was looking at also the differences between deuxième, right? And there is a word second, exactly that's spelled as a second, but it's called a second, right? So there is a word second, right, in French. But she didn't say le second sexe. That's interesting too, right? So second is more like it's a second class, right? It's a very hierarchical, right? It's a second class. So deuxième, again, is ordinal. It's simply first, second, third, right? It doesn't have to be inferiorized or prioritized, in other words, right? That's interesting, le deuxième, right? That's interesting. So 제2의 so when we do that in Korean, 제2의 E is also interesting, right? E doesn't have to be hierarchical, right? 제2, 또 제3, 제4, right? It could be actually better, right? Right? So the use of the number is very interesting to hear too. Okay. So now we get to the part, I know that I'm detaining you too long, and so I'm going to move a bit quickly. On ne n'est pas femme, on le devient. Femme is, or in English, in Anglophile, right? Or anglicized, right? Word femme, we tend to use femme as in like, you know, as in someone feminine, no? Or like in sort of, you know, in LGBTQ kind of, you know, discourse, you know, butch femme, kind of, you know, sort of femme too, right? So femme or femme, or like femme is in French, it also means like a wife, right? And femme has this very particular networks of meanings, right? And it's not exactly the same as woman or 여자. Right, as I was telling you, 여자 is a kind of interesting, and woman is also, we know it, but it's not really used in the same way, right? So this is the original sentence. On ne n'est pas femme, on le devient. Got it? Look at this. This is a 1953 translation. Okay. What about this? 2009. Have you spotted the differences? Or difference? One difference. One more. This is 53. This is 09. Oh, right? Oh, it's missing, right? Let's go back to the original. Is there a or win? No. On ne n'est pas femme, not win femme. Born woman. Right? Also, it's an idiomatic expression, like a born carpenter, born teacher. But still, Beauvoi was playing on this idea of born woman, right? Not a woman, which chimes with this concept of what? Is a bundling, right? Women are not individuated. That's the question, right? Now, what does she say? On le devient. Le means it refers to what? That, right? It's not la. On la devient, right? On le devient, right? So it becomes that, right? So one is not born woman, but becomes woman. This is a spirit in which the new translators were trying to recuperate, right? This idea of woman, right? There's a whole conference of debates about this, and I'm part of it too. So we are actually writing a book, and I'm doing my little article about this, pros and cons, right? Now, isn't that fascinating? I mean, it might be simply a linguistic difference in question, but it really holds the whole what? Debate. Right? Is Beauvoir actually almost endorsing the kind of the deprivation of individuated subjectivity? Right? When she talks about on le devient, right? Is she saying women cannot be an independent subject? Right? What about authentic women? What about the une femme libre, right? Free woman that she talks about at the end, right? A free woman is being born right at this point, right? Une femme libre en train de naître, right? Is in the process of being born, right? And then she talked about une femme libre, right? It's interesting. So there's a debate, right? And really, this debate becomes important because it really also gives a different light to the questions about the identity of gendered embodiment, right? And also what it means to be a woman, right? Here, I want to give a kind of, this is a 2009, 여자가 태어나는 것이 아니라 만들어지는 것이다. What would be an issue with this translation? I'm not talking about some particular empirical problems with this sentence, I think is well constructed. This is how we say it. This is correct in Korean, right? But Beauvoir didn't begin with woman. This is an interpretation of what that could mean, right? Beauvoir began with what? On. Right? On. So let me give you this. This is a complete, more or less, on le devient, right? It's a on ne n'est pas femme, on le devient, right? Le deuxième sexe. Chinese has the word heaven, right? The heavenly mandate, right? And I was asking why heaven, and nobody could really explain. You see the heaven there? 천생, right? 여인, 부시, 천생적 in Korean, right? This is like a natal birth, right? But heavenly birth, right? 하늘에서 준 sex, right? 하늘에서 명을 받은 is a fate, right? They like it because it's a, but they couldn't exactly explain why they had to be so. It kind of had to be there. Interesting. This is naturalized sex, right? Then 후에 형성, right? Very interesting. Now, in German, you have a Mann, right? Mann. So if you read it like in English, it's like a man. But das Mann is also like this impersonal third person, right? That third person impersonal. That's what it is. But in Korean, we don't have it as such. Interesting, right? And I'm not saying that we cannot translate that. What I'm saying, or pointing to, is that the fact that it is interesting that this impossibility points to certain structural configuration of our language. If we say 사람은 여자로 태어나지 않다, that was an old translation. That sounds very weird. We don't say that. 사람 is already assumed, right? So what it shows also is that the Korean kind of imaginary, right, culturally or metaphysically, does not really allow this kind of syntactical structure. And also one is not the same as all, right? And the way, as some of you also may know, the way the one is used in British English is different from the way it's used in American English, right? One doesn't say that. It's kind of, how do you translate that, right? And so what I'm saying is this. This is a very, very strange, also mistranslation. Random translation. Again, another thing is this. 여자가 되는 것이다, right? Okay. I didn't just, 나는 그냥 교수가 된 거 아니야. 나는 공부했어요. 공부했어서 그냥 나는 유대한 거 아니야, 그죠? Right? It's interesting, right? So the devenir is achievement, right? Achievement. You have to work to get it, right? 커피가 차갑게 되는 거랑 내가 교수되는 거랑 다른 되는 거야. 그래서 이렇게 만드는 거는 또 있어. 그러니까 내가 만드는 건 아니야. 만드는 건 좀 이상해. 내가 만두도 아니고. 이거는 아주 이 된다는 것도 it's really, really interesting, right? How you understand, right, that concept. So here. So another example is this. I talked about this earlier also. The kiosk said it really points to the questions of subjectivity in our broader kind of cultural imaginary and ways of life. The way subject is gendered is very implicit. Right? It's almost unspoken of, right? So that, let's say, I talked about this example. Say, I want an apple. To translate that into Korean. If I say 나는 사과 원해요, that sounds very selfish. 나 사과 줘. It sounds like that, right? 나 사과 줘. 나 주세요. Right? It's like 나. So we don't say I actually in Korean. 사과 주세요. 사과 있어요. You turn 사과 into subject, rather. Me, I withdraw, right? In our formulation. It's interesting syntactical difference, right? And so I think that it discloses the kind of different ways of inhabiting the world, right? And so here, sort of my guerrilla translation. So this is what I'm thinking about. So I think 아무나 or 누구도. So 누구도 여자를 표현하지 않는다. 여자가 된다. The reason why I'm also trying to do that is because here you have the colon. 누구도 여자를 표현하지 않는다. So I don't say 사람은 여자를 표현하지 않는다 because that you already limit 사람, right? It's different. It's interesting. I was talking about this in Germany, and I had a couple of Swedish students coming in, and they were saying, in Sweden, actually, I realized we don't have one or something equivalent to. We just have to use men. So you have to transgenderize from the beginning. Man does not, when he's a woman, becomes woman. Already is a transgender, right? And it's interesting. So, or another is, you just, okay, I think just the way I say, because 사과주세요 같이, 나도 say 나 사과주세요. We don't need that subject. We just really assume in the interactional context, right? So, 여자가 태어나나? 아니, 여자가 되는 것이. That's a little conversation. Why not? I think that's the kind of spirit of what she's saying. Huh? When this sentence is also kind of all in French because it's experimental. She's doing something to the French syntax itself, right? Because she's using le, right? And she's like using, it's a torrential, right? So it's like a murmuring. 여자가 되는, 하나나 되는 거지. Right? That's the word.
Why don't you say 그것이?
Well, it's because the le refers to
So you say 그것이.
그것이 그게 되는 거지. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, maybe that's yeah. 그게 되는. I think that's actually good. I like that. Yeah. Because it opens up, right? Because it can be any other, right? Exactly. That's good. So you don't have to have like repetition. Right? I will take note of that. That's good. Yeah. 그게 is really so it's like it's like 거시기. All right. It's a very it's indeterminate, but it's sort of specific in particular context. Right? 거시기 뭐냐 하는 그래서 우리가 어떻게 되냐? So I think about this sort of. So basically, the idea is this: by looking at the different translations and transposition or transgendering of this very generative sentence in the French original, we can extract the concept, right? What it tries to communicate, right? And use it as a lens through which we theorize, right? Our own kind of a context. So, the last one. This will be a little quicker, and then this is where I'm going into a bit of now Korean mode. Are you a virgin? This is when I was studying at Beauvoi, I had some friends coming in, and I had a Canadian friend, and I remember sort of 택시 탔는데 white, Canadian 친구 있는데 요즘에는 택시 드라이버들이 얘기를 이렇게 막 말 안 해. 옛날에는 막 라디오 틀고 막 얘기하고 그런 것밖에 그런 게 아닌지 모르겠는데 it's like a very kind of like 1990s, and so very kind of they immediately trying to talk to you, and so 그래서 외국 사람들은 말 없으니까 튕기는데 그래서 어디서 왔어요? It's like where's Canada? And I think he was trying to sort of practice his English, and suddenly he says, "Are you a virgin?" Right? And in my mind, I understood. He meant 처녀요. Right? That means, are you married? Right? Are you married? But he was translating it. Are you a virgin? Right? I remember that quite clearly because it was really hilarious. Right? I can tell from this. It's a 사투리, right? 처녀요. Are you a virgin? And he actually was trying to understand. This is a translingual movement. Something is lost in a very, very interesting way. Why? Because 처녀요, right? That assumes so many things, right? That metonymical displacement, right? 결혼을 했으면 처녀가 아니고 결혼 안 했으면 처녀일 수밖에 없다. 라는 assumption이 있는 거가 is reflected in that sentence. And it was kind of interesting. So, and I was laughing so hard because I happened to know that she was not. Anyway, so this is is what I got from when I was talking about this in China. I was talking about other, right? And so I just took a photo of that. I asked my students, Chinese students, to write words on mother, with the different words. And she looked about there are different words of mother. And so it was interesting to look at the different figures, right? When, ni, and me. This is actually another inspiration behind my talk today. I'm also relearning Korean language. I'm experiencing all slang and different expressions and how people use the word. So we're talking about 여자, but like 처녀 or 결혼했냐 or 여러 가지. So I went to some clothing shop because I happened to say a lot of words. I want to buy some shirt, and so I wanted to exchange or something. And then this 아저씨, right? Like my age, I think. Somebody said, 아유 어머님이 그러시는. I was so shocked, so I didn't ask anybody, but I did some Google search. What is this harmony about? And I discovered that this is a kind of, because ajumani is sort of, people don't like use it, it's a euphemism, right? So he meant well. But the fact that he meant it well was so interesting, right? Why is that just the chonyoyo and omi? When I read me, it sounds like a so this is like, it was so interesting. So mother, right, and the Emmy, and all sorts of things. So, but I heard that this is like a way when they're trying to sell you something, they're trying to flatter you, right? I'm not flattered. Anyway, so as I said, so what matters is how does this 여자 turning into something else in every point, right? Whose 여자 is it? For whom? So 여자 subjectivity, in particular translingual Korean context, is really important, right? So what I thought about is this. There is a split between 지칭 and 호칭. I think I talked about it, some of you maybe, I'm not sure, but because I tend to kind of think aloud, and so I talked about it. So referential language is, okay, well, 여자 교수님 or whatever, but indexical or addresses it. This 고객님 is a word that I hear a lot, but that's like commercial language, right? But outside 고객님, everybody has to negotiate how to situate, right? How to position these people, right? 여사님, 사모님, whatever. Suddenly, 어머님. That was kind of almost flattering, but I'm not flattered. Anyway, so you have a kind of referential indexical split where you have the kind of designation, right? Becomes an issue, right? This position, right? And so how we think about that in terms of, so this is the final part. So when I thought about it, I began to, I don't know, I just came up with something. I made it up last night. I thought I should sit down and start cataloging some of the words that I know about 여 and na in Korean, right? And I'm a Cartesian. I studied philosophy and so this, what I do, we make a map, right? So this is like a 여 word, right? And this is like a 남녀 칠세 부동서. So there's a division, right? So what I see here is this. 여 has all sorts of kind of, say references, right? 여사, 여티과, it doesn't exist in na, right? So, and in, right, 사람, person, last man, if it's here, you have all sorts of kind of proliferation of different words depending on particular context. And I call that gender imbalance sheet. You know, that balance sheet, right? So you see, obviously, this is an emptier here, right? not much, because we assume, right? This is like, this is the other stuff, other people that becomes of flowers, right? Gardening around the solid kind of, sort of soil. And so it's interesting. And so, so this is like you, like a poetess, or like it would be like a lab professor. I mean, I heard that in Spanish they use the different kind of, also yosa and yoshi, etc. And so, and then, I might be wrong about this, but I think it's something neutral. Yangban, that's a kind of almost elevation of women, it's a kind of honorary member of Yangban, right? Then they would neutralize your gender, or Yangban이 어떻게, so it's like you are supposed to feel a bit more elevated, right? Exactly. Or young or God, right? So now, this is what I find it. So I learned the word mese, yose. All these words I learned, this time it was fascinating because I'm also kind of collecting subconsciously this. And then I was curious whether there's mese nyao, but there's no mese nyao. There's only mese nam. Because 내가 섹시한 남자, mese nam, right? 요색 남은 요리해서 섹시한 남자, right? mese nam. And I'm watching the thing, Beauvoi for every TV, so I get to watch it. But it's interesting. We have 요색 nam, but we don't have mese 녀. We have to ask this question: What is this imbalance, right? Because we can start using it, right? But the thing is that it's not. It doesn't gain the currency's interest, right? And also, there's no 된장 nam, no kimchi nam, right? Because that's interesting. And I noticed that is because this burden of carrying tradition falls on women, right? What's 된장녀? 된장녀 is somebody who is a Korean woman, but who acts like she is not, or she is looking for or doing some trendy kind of stuff, right? And so now the kind of certain, it's like a whole question of modernity versus tradition, right? I think this sort of imbalance or injustice, right, is reflected in the way that we compose this concept, right? And there is no kimchi nam, or kimchi or 된장 nam. It's only 녀, right? And that's the kind of thing that I find interesting. Is in part inspired by the sort of a close look at becoming 그거. You'll be around. The femme is like so. At any point, anybody can become femme. 여자가 되는 거예요. 보면은 이렇게 막 회장님 만나면 그 회사 직원이 여자가 되는 거예요. 그래서 사장님 오셨습니까? 집에 가면은 남자인데 나오면 여자가 되는 거예요. Gender role, right? 여자 같이 되는 거예요. It's really the becoming something, right? So we have to really de-essentialize certain kind of gender sort of assumptions about normative, right? Identities, right? Because words actually, right, not only reflect, right, those norms, but inventive and creative and use and kind of creation of words actually change the way we think about this sort of gender dimension too, right? And so this is my kind of slide. I learned Korean in a minute, like quick and dirty version, right? So I just find it so interesting having sort of kind of moved a little bit to sort of so-called sort of the Anglo-European languages and like inhabiting them for a while and then just coming back and I get to see this language in a very, very interesting and because I studied. I had to study because it changed so much and I don't know what was going on. And as somebody who's been living in kind of say different languages, so two languages back and forth for many, many years, and so it's a kind of interesting to see how language can become a kind of port, right? Through which you actually have access to something that's going on. And so I hope that was helpful, and I apologize for taking up a bit of too much of time, but this is pretty much the end of my talk. And there is something to add. That's from the also Tracy, right? K hairstyle. So you have a K woman, K man, right? Interesting commodification of gender, right? So K pop. of K this and that, right? And so and this is obviously